Welcome, welcome. Welcome, everybody. Super excited for everybody's that you're attending Galen's defense today. As most of you probably already know, Galen has done some amazing work at intersection of data science and social computing and AI that he's going to tell us about. His work has turned heads on Reddit, also received repeated academic recognition. In fact, it wasn't one, but four best paper awards that I counted during a PhD, which, my goodness. However, honestly, what I think beyond what Galen has given to the Allen School as a researcher and in terms of the quality of his research, I think really goes much beyond that. I have always perceived Galen as the social architect of the fabric in our lab, and honestly, the Allen School as a whole. And I see everybody nodding, including lots of people that would have a strong sense of that. So Galen is also an incredible human being. I really admire him and am thankful for his constant attention towards everybody around him and not around him, and his generous investments into the various communities we have here. I truly believe he's made everyone's experience better. I again see some nodding, and I could give lots of examples, but I won't for time, and I'm pretty sure we can just ask anybody in the room as well. Whenever Galen does indeed graduate, and we're getting closer, like we'll lose a lot more than a spectacular researcher. So I feel very lucky to get to be one of your co-advisors, Galen. And I'll introduce the committee as well. So we're excited to have Amy here as a co-advisor, Mako joining us at GSR. We have Yulia Tsvetkov in the back, and we have Sanjay Kairam on Zoom. First of all, thank you all for serving on Galen's committee over the years, including today. Many of you have participated in defenses, but perhaps not everybody. So how this will work is that Galen will give about 45 minutes of a talk. We'll then have a public Q&A that I strongly encourage everybody to participate in. I'll then ask everybody politely to leave except his committee and Galen for a private session that is part of the defense. Before we get started, maybe do
I'm excited for your talk. I have really appreciated being your co-advisor.
Awesome. So the floor is yours, Galen. Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Tim, for those really kind words, and thanks, Amy. And yeah, it really means so much to me to have all these familiar faces here to support me. Can the folks on Zoom hear okay? I saw some nodding while Tim was talking, so that seemed like a good sign. So just really quickly, for the folks on Zoom, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate that. I'm going to hide the Zoom chat while I'm presenting, but Tina has really kindly offered to help out with sort of managing things that are happening on Zoom for me. So I would just ask that if you have questions, I do encourage that. Please just put them in the Zoom chat, and then we'll get them relayed to the room as well. I think that's probably the best way to manage that. So awesome. Okay, let me get that out of the way. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here and to talk to you all a little bit about my work improving online community governance at web scale. Online communities are ubiquitous, right? Something like 2/3 of the global population is on social media. And number is a lot higher in the United States and other developed countries. And the average online community member spends more than 2 hours a day online. So clearly, online communities are a huge part of pretty much all of our lives. And I really don't mean this as a bad thing, right? There are lots of great reasons to use online communities and things that they do for us, right? Online communities bring people together. They provide education and entertainment. And they also enable new types of communities that wouldn't be possible in offline contexts. But it's not all good, right? There's been a lot of concerns that have been raised recently about online communities contributing to things like the mental health crisis, to political polarization, and also concerns about things like bullying, abuse, and harassment. So what influences what happens in online communities? Well, pretty much all online communities rely on some form of governance to increase the good parts of the community while also decreasing the bad parts of the community. And what do I mean by governance? Well, there's lots of different aspects to governance, but today I'm going to mostly focus on moderators. And moderators are people with special privileges who can take actions in order to improve the community as they see fit. And this varies from community to community and from platform to platform, which we'll get to in a little bit. But moderators, who can also be called admins or mods, right? They can be volunteers or they can be paid. They can be visible or they can be hidden. They can be community members or they can be outsiders, and they can be elected or they can be appointed. And they can take different types of actions. They can set rules and they can enforce those rules by doing things like removing content and banning users. Now, that was pretty abstract, so I'm going to make this a little bit more concrete by introducing folks who aren't familiar with it to Reddit, which is a platform that we'll talk a lot more about, because I think that Reddit is a really great place to do research on online communities. Why is that? Well, first of all, Reddit is really big. It's got more than 1 billion monthly active users, making it the 5th most popular social media platform in the United States. And Reddit is composed of thousands of different communities, which are called subreddits. And each subreddit has its own topic, its own moderators, and its own rules. But many of the moderation affordances on Reddit are analogous to those that are on other platforms, which makes Reddit a natural place to study things that could generalize to other platforms as well. And then lastly, it's relatively easy to access data on Reddit compared to on other platforms. So if you will indulge me in a little personal anecdote here, just going to share briefly some of my own experience with Reddit. Can I try some audience participation? Show of hands, who uses Reddit in the room just like a little bit? Okay, we got like almost everyone's hands are up. Let's make this harder. How many people have been on Reddit for over 10 years? Couple hands. Any of you folks use the Pix subreddit? 1 or 2 hands. Okay, so it is conceivable that some of you may have been on the Pix subreddit on October 16th, 2012. On October 16th, 2012, I was a sophomore in high school, and at the time, a lot of my friends used Reddit. A lot of my friends thought it was really cool. I used Reddit, but I was pretty much just a lurker. I never really posted or commented anything. I just looked at what other people were doing. But I thought Reddit was cool enough that I bought a Reddit cycling bike jersey that said Reddit on the chest in big letters. And on October 16th, 2012, I get a phone call from one of my friends saying, Galen, you're on the very front page, the top of the page of Reddit right now. And they were right. This is a picture of me, sophomore year in high school. I'm not sure why I was looking so sad in this picture, but what had happened was I, on my lunch break from school, had gone to a food truck wearing this jersey, and one of the employees at the food truck was also a Redditor, and this was back in the day when it was like cool to meet Redditors in real life. And without telling me, had taken my picture and had posted it online, and thousands of people had seen this and whatever. And so I had to create an account to jump into the comments and be like, that's me, and get all my Reddit karma from that. So that's how I created my Reddit account. But in that time, Reddit, in this past 13 years, Reddit has become a place that's really near to my heart. A couple of years after that happened, I started moderating my first subreddit, and I actively have moderated subreddits for about 10 years now. The photo critique subreddit, which is the largest subreddit that I moderate, has grown quite a bit in that time to almost 2 million community members since I started. And then I've also been on the Reddit Moderator Council for more than 3 years, and I worked with Sanjay as a computational social science fellow at Reddit during my PhD as well. And I'm sure the question that many of you are wondering is, Galen, do you still have the cycling jersey? And the answer is yes. It's maybe not quite as baggy as it was when I was in high school, but I'm actually going to take this off so I don't sweat my brains out. Okay, so It's always fun when someone starts undressing during the So I was talking a little bit about how I moderate some communities. And I was talking earlier about how moderation is something that underpins pretty much every single online community. But a lot of moderation is not necessarily obviously visible to the people who participate in those communities. And so I thought that it might be helpful for us to sort of take a brief look at what a moderator actually does. And the point that I want to make here is that moderators make lots and lots and lots of decisions. And one of the most frequent decisions that we make is about removing content. And so here's a picture that someone posted in the community that I moderate. We have a nice picture of a toad under the Milky Way. And someone else in that community commented, "Why would anyone want a frog in their Milky Way image? It's so distracting." And you can see that someone sort of reported that for being rude. And so as a moderator, I'm faced with this decision. Do I remove this content or do I leave it up? And in this particular case, I sort of commented officially as a moderator, and I decided to leave the content up. But I said, look, I can't justify removing this because it doesn't really break any of the rules, but, it kind of, a lot of people seem to disagree with you. And so the point that I'm making here is that there's more to moderation than just like the hard actions of removing stuff or banning users, etc. Right? There's also this additional question of how should I interact with the community? How should I, communicate my decisions that I've made? And I mentioned, a little bit about breaking the rules. So let's take a look at what the rules are in my subreddit. And of course, the big question here is like, well, are these the right rules for me to have? And that's a tricky sort of question to evaluate. But maybe one place that we could start thinking about that is there another similar community that we can compare the rules to? And so here we have my subreddit, the photo critique subreddit on the left, and the I took a picture subreddit on the right. So this is a similar subreddit where you post pictures and can get comments on them. And if we look between these two subreddits, we can see, they have a similar topic. They're pretty similar in terms of their age, and they're pretty similar in terms of their size, each of which has about 3,000 weekly submissions. But what about the rules? So my subreddit's rules on the left, I took a picture subreddit rules on the right. Don't worry about all the text. I'll point out the stuff that I think is important here. We see a lot of commonalities. Both subreddits have rules that say you can't submit someone else's picture. And both subreddits have rules that say you have to engage with the community after you submitted the picture. But there are some differences. Like, look here, right? The I took a picture subreddit has this comment saying that you can't submit nudity except for on Mondays. My subreddit has had some issues with people excessively posting nudity. So is this a rule that I should add to my community? It seems plausible, but I'm not really sure yet. And if I did want to add that rule, well, maybe I would also need some more moderators to help me enforce that rule. So let's take a little bit of a look at the difference in moderators between these two communities. Here's my subreddit on the left. There's me. Here's the moderators of the other subreddit. And my subreddit only has 11 moderators, whereas the I Took a Picture subreddit has more than twice as many moderators, even though it's about the same size of community. So in just a few minutes, I've already been confronted with a ton of different decisions that I need to make, right? Like, what content should I remove? How should I communicate with the community? What rules to have? How should I enforce those rules? And how many moderators should I have? And how should I enforce them? Right? These are tricky decisions to make. I didn't know it at the time, but maybe that's why I was making that expression in that picture. But you might be wondering, like, do these decisions really actually matter? Is there differences in how happy community members are in their communities? Right? These are sort of the outcomes in the community. And there's lots of different ways to think about outcomes. There's lots of different ways to think about, sort of broadly speaking, how happy community members are. But maybe the most straightforward one is to just go talk to the community members and ask them how they feel about their experience. And I did exactly that. I talked to members of the photo critique subreddit, and I talked to members of the I Took a Picture subreddit. And I found that people in the photo critique subreddit think that it's more safe and also more varied, but people in the I Took a Picture subreddit think that sort of the quality of the pictures there are higher quality. And we'll go into these outcomes in more detail soon, but for now, that we can see that even just in these two communities, there's variance not only in the governance practices, but also in the outcomes as well. And we can't yet sort of tease out these differences and how they're connected to one another, but this suggests that there are sort of likely connections between the two. So to recap, communities and community moderators have lots of decisions that they have to make. And current practices as well as outcomes are varied. And so again, this suggests that changing governance practices might be able to improve outcomes in communities, but clearly there's a lot more that we sort of need to disentangle here. So can we approach this problem scientifically? In the rest of my defense, I'm going to present a scientific approach to improving online community governance, not just for a handful of communities, but really at web scale. So what do I think is necessary to develop a science of online community governance? There are 3 parts to my dissertation research, all of which build upon one another. So for starters, I think that the science of online community governance should be grounded in what's important to community members and how each community's needs are different. And a lot of previous work in this space focuses on specific harms like misinformation or abuse, and those are really important, but here I want to take a sort of comprehensive and holistic view of community health. So to this end, the first part of my research characterizes community members' values. Prior to this work, what community members value for their communities wasn't really well understood, so I conducted the first large-scale surveys of the things that community members care about. Next, I think that the science of community governance really should be empirical. We've already seen that there's a lot of natural diversity across different communities, and we'll measure and leverage this natural diversity in order to identify the most promising governance strategies. And doing this lets us utilize existing as well as historical data and generalize from thousands of different communities, which lets us study far more things than we would be able to if we needed to run an experiment for every single thing that we wanted to examine. So in the second part of my talk, I'll assess current governance practices across thousands of communities to identify those that are most promising. And then lastly, the science of community governance needs to be impactful, right? All of this work is kind of useless if we can't actually translate it into changes that make people's experiences better. So to maximize the real world impact of our work, we need to get out of the ivory tower and actually engage and collaborate with communities and build useful systems. So in the last part of my research, I'm going to focus on deploying good governance, including distributing best practices and deploying systems in partnerships with communities. Before we jump into the first part of that, pause here, any questions or clarifications? And maybe we can, perfect opportunity, please interrupt me with clarifications. I'll pause at the end of each of these sections for more questions, but let's maybe hold the big picture tying across multiple different aspects of the work towards the end. All right. Okay. So we say that we want to make online communities better, but what does it actually mean to make online communities better? We realized here that community members' values for their own communities are poorly understood. And as I mentioned a second ago, previous work mostly focuses on specific aspects of those communities and important aspects, but here we wanted to have sort of a holistic and comprehensive understanding of what is important to community members. So how do we do that? Well, we asked community members about their values. We conducted the largest to date survey of community members' values with almost 3,000 participants. And there were 2 parts to that, a smaller qualitative survey and a larger quantitative survey. And in that qualitative survey, we asked open-ended questions to capture the full breadth of community members' values. And so we categorized those responses in order to develop a taxonomy of 9 different values, ranging from quality all the way down to democracy. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on that, but I want to point out some things that stand out to me. This first one might seem obvious, but these values cover a really wide range of community attributes. And many of these values aren't well studied. Safety, for example, is a pretty frequent topic for research, but the quality of content, which we find is almost universally the most important value to community members, is really challenging to study because the nature of what makes for high quality content varies so much from one community to another community. And I'll come back to some work that we're doing to measure content quality in a community specific way at the end of this talk. Next, many of these values are often in tension with one another. So for example, restricting the ability of new community members to participate might improve the quality of content, but it also could decrease inclusion because it makes harder for new people to participate. So as a result, communities often have to make trade-offs, which we can frame as trade-offs between these different values. and understanding how different communities place different importance on these values helps us understand those trade-offs. And that's exactly what we did in our larger quantitative survey. So in that quantitative survey, for each of those 9 values, we asked about 3 different dimensions. First, we asked about how important the value is. Next, we asked about the current state of the value. How is the community doing with regards to that value right now? And then we asked about the desired change of the value. How would you like this value to change? Joe?
Right, so those 9 values, or did you specifically ask about those?
So those, well, that's a great question. The question was sort of, Joe asked, are the 9 values emergent, or do we specifically ask about those? In the qualitative survey, we asked open-ended questions without those values, and then we sort of broke those values up into broke the responses up into idea units and sort of clustered them together to come up with that taxonomy, and then we use that to give structure to the larger qualitative survey. So that's the qualitative survey is where we asked about these, or sorry, the quantitative survey. So let's look at how values vary between communities, and we'll start with how values vary between communities of different types. So to do this, we average across all of the responses that we receive for a given community, and then we categorize that community's topic. And when examining trust, we find that news-sharing communities consider trust to be more important, while trust is less important to meme-sharing communities. Identity-focused communities, like those for LGBTQ groups or other specific groups, those identity communities rank safety as more important than other communities do. Meme-sharing communities place special emphasis on the variety of content, which is less important for identity communities. On the other hand, those identity communities place greater emphasis on inclusion relative to other communities. And just a quick note that here and in all the remaining slides, I'm including bootstrap 95% confidence intervals so we can assess our statistical power. So what does this mean? Well, I think the key takeaway here is that there's no one-size-fits-all set of values. There's a lot of variance between different communities. Of course, values also vary dramatically amongst members of the same communities. And by using multiple responses from different members of the same community, we can measure how much disagreement there is within a given community over those values. So let's start with safety. Here, we're plotting the amount of disagreement for safety in light blue compared to the other values, which are in this really hard to see gray. So sorry about that. And what we find is that there's relative consensus on how safety should change, right? The blue here is sort of in the middle or even to the left, less disagreement than some of those other grayed out values. So for the most part, community members agree that safety should be improved. Where folks disagree, however, is over how important safety is. There's more disagreement over the importance of safety than just about any other value. And then the current state of safety is even more disagreed over. There's almost twice as much disagreement over how safe communities currently are than any other value. And I think that a likely explanation for this is that people who've personally had experiences online that made them feel unsafe likely have a far poorer perception of how safe their communities are than people who haven't had those experiences. And even if those people are in the minority, their experiences and their values are clearly important, so we need to be careful to protect them. We also look at how community moderators' values differ from those of non-moderator community members. Again, examining safety here, we don't really find that there's a significant difference between how moderators perceive the current state of safety relative to non-moderators. But we do find that moderators more strongly want to improve safety and also think that safety is more important than other community members do. And as a moderator of some subreddits myself, I was also interested in how moderators' preferences for democracy differ from those of other community members. And on this one, we find that moderators think that their communities are less democratic, that moderators want less democracy, and that moderators think that democracy is less important than non-moderator community members do. So to me, this suggests that community members might want to be more involved in the governance of their community than those who are currently in power want them to be. So these community value surveys provide us with a sort of grounded foundation. We have an understanding of the breadth of community values and an understanding of how those values vary both within and between different communities. Next, we're going to assess current governance practices, but again, I'll just pause here and see if there are any questions. Anything on Zoom, Tina? All right, sweet. Okay, so assessing current practices. In part two here, our goal is to assess current governance practices at a large scale and leverage that existing natural diversity in governance as well as in outcomes in order to identify promising governance strategies and maybe even be able to make suggestions for how moderators might improve their communities. But to do this, we need a scalable outcome measure, some way to measure how well governance is working in a given community. And before this work, there weren't really any good methods to sort of measure the general success of governance at a large scale. And so we developed our own method. And we developed a method to measure community members' perceptions of their moderators. So I'm going to start by telling you about that, and then we'll use that outcome to assess the efficacy of sort of two different categories of governance. First, moderator workload and how engaged moderators are, and then rules and how those rules are enforced. But let's start with that outcome measure of perceptions of moderators. So the key insight behind this method is that people talk publicly in the subreddits that they use about their moderators. So someone might say something like, the mods in this subreddit are useless. Certainly I've had, as a moderator myself, the fair share of similar sorts of messages. But people also might say something like, hey, the subreddit is a cesspool of garbage, but the moderators, they're doing their best. And so in this first example, right, this person is pretty clearly expressing a negative perception of the moderators. In this second example, the subreddit is a cesspool of garbage, but the moderators, they're doing their best. So this person is expressing a positive perception of the moderators. And our moderator discourse classifier measures community members' perceptions of moderators both automatically and scalably. And there are 3 steps to our pipeline for that, a pre-filtering step, a detection step, and a classification step. And I'm not going to go into more details about how it works, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. So most importantly, this approach enables the measurement of governance outcomes at a massive scale. Using our pipeline, we classify every post and comment discussing moderators from almost 8,500 subreddits over an 18-month period, collecting almost 2 million posts and comments. And actually, I think that 18 months is a little bit outdated now. We've processed some more data, and we make all of this data public so that other researchers can use this in their own research as well. So with these data, a natural first question to ask is, how do those 9 values from our surveys in the first part, how are they associated with different communities' perceptions of their moderators, which we can measure automatically? And so on this plot here, on the y-axis, we're looking at what fraction of the things people are saying about their moderators have positive versus negative sentiment. And note that these won't sum to 1 because there's also a neutral class, which I'm not showing here. So let's start with trust, which was one of those 9 values that I mentioned earlier. Here on the x-axis, we're grouping communities by how trustworthy they rate themselves, based on, again, those survey results. And we find that the more trustworthy a community considers itself, the fewer negative things its members say about its moderators. And as negative goes down, positive goes up. So while people in general, as you can see, say fewer positive things than negative things about the moderators, in communities where people consider themselves more trustworthy, people say more positive things about the moderators. And we find similar patterns for many of our other values. Communities that rate themselves as more engaged, more safe, have higher quality content, and are more inclusive, all say more positive and fewer negative things about their moderators. For other values, the story is a little bit less clear, but there is a clear standout, and that's size. Communities that say that they feel like large communities say fewer negative and more negative and fewer positive things about their moderators than communities that say that they feel small. And it turns out that this result also holds if you switch from using self-reported perceptions of community size to more objective measures like the number of posts and comments submitted. So on the whole, this suggests that people's perceptions of their moderators align with other important community values, although members of smaller communities generally have more favorable perceptions of their moderators. So now that we have our outcome measure, let's use this to examine our first set of governance practices, moderator workload and engagement. But in order to do this, we'll need to collect a little bit more data. So here we use the Wayback Machine to reconstruct timelines of who was a moderator of what subreddit when, which also lets us know how many moderators any subreddit has at a given point in time. And then we combine this with moderators' public posts and comments across all subreddits, which lets us understand how active those moderators were before, during, and after their time as moderators. So let's start by looking at moderator workload. The y-axis here is the same as in those previous plots that we looked at, but the x-axis now we're looking at moderator workload. So how many posts and comments does the average moderator have to look at on an average day? And so higher workload here is to the right. And we find that generally communities with lower moderator workloads have more positive perceptions of their moderators. So this suggests that maybe for overworked mods, adding new mods might help. And this is actually something that we can look at. We can use a difference in difference analysis to look at how things change before versus after a new mod is added. And here, in general, we find that adding new mods is associated with improved perceptions of governance. But which mods are best for current moderators to add as their new colleagues? And here we find substantial differences in how much of an improvement there is depending on which moderator is added. So we find that moderators who are engaged in their community before their time as a moderator, moderators who continue to be engaged in their community during their time as a moderator, and moderators who are active in other subreddits besides the one that they moderate are all associated with the largest improvement in community perceptions of moderators. So to summarize, moderators seem most positively received by their communities when they aren't overworked, when they are engaged with the community before and during their tenures, and when they are active in other subreddits besides their own. And I don't have time to go into all of the details, but in the paper, we also look at things like moderator recruiting practices, as well as how much experience moderators have when they're added to subreddits. Okay, so let's shift over to rules and their enforcement. Rules are a really big part of what moderators can directly control within their communities. But there are some questions, right? How strictly should mods enforce the rules that they have? And what types of rules should they impose? So let's start by taking a look at the strictness of rule enforcement. And we can measure this by looking at the fraction of posts and comments that moderators remove for breaking the rules. This plot here has the same y-axis as the ones that we've already looked at, showing the fraction of things that people are saying with positive versus negative sentiment. But on the x-axis here, we're looking at, for each subreddit, the fraction of content that is posted by community members that then ends up being removed by moderators. So stricter enforcement is to the right here. And we find that in general, stricter rule enforcement is associated with more negative perceptions of mods. But, and I think this is key, this doesn't hold in all types of communities. In news sharing communities, in particular, we find the opposite trend. In news sharing communities where rules are enforced more strictly, negative perceptions of moderators actually go down. So this suggests that the type of community and the type of content is important, and that rule enforcement should be tailored to the rule and the community, and that in particular, different types of content might be more amenable to more strict rule enforcement. But what happens when moderators add a new rule? Here we use the Wayback Machine to find when subreddits add new rules over a 5-year period. And we find that immediately after a new rule is added, on average, positive perceptions and neutral perceptions of moderators go up, while negative perceptions of moderators decrease. However, as you can see, this effect doesn't seem very durable, right? After about 6 months, here at the end of each of these graphs, the effect seems to diminish, and community perceptions of governance aren't really significantly different than they were before the rule was changed. Of course, though, there are lots of different types of rules that a subreddit can implement. So what are the differences between different types of rules? Well, to study this at scale, we need a method to categorize rules. And here we use a taxonomy of rule attributes that we developed ourselves, but was informed by the taxonomy of rules from Casey Feisler's great Reddit rules paper. And then we built a categorization pipeline that works pretty well. I'm happy to chat more about the details of that a little bit later. So our categorization of rules examines 3 attributes of rules, and we classify these independently. So those are the rule tone, the rule target, and then the rule topic. So first, rule tone. one choice that moderators have to make is how they phrase their rules. And they can phrase those rules prescriptively, saying, how to do something like be nice, or they can phrase those rules restrictively, don't do something like don't be mean. In terms of rule target, rules can also target different things. So some rules target the content of a post or comment. A subreddit with about a TV show might have like a no spoilers rule, for example. Some rules target the format of posts. So like there might be a rule that says if you have spoilers, they have to be properly tagged. And then some rules target users. Like some subreddits prohibit participation by accounts that are less than a month old, for example. And then in rule topic, we look at 12 specific topics of rules, things like spam, respect for other members in the community, and bans. And again, all of these things are classified independently from one another. Yes, Tina. Excellent.
Opinions about safety, inclusion, etc., versus how much content gets banned.
Versus how much content gets banned. That's a great question, Serena. Hi, Serena. Thanks for being here. I don't believe that we've actually looked at that specifically, but I will use this opportunity to give another shout out and say that our survey response data, where we ask about all of those things, is public, as is the data about perceptions of moderators and the moderation data as well. So if you go to the website, that would be about a 30-second pandas query that I'd be happy to run with you if you want. Awesome. Okay, so it turns out that rule additions are relatively rare occurrences. And so we don't have enough data to do difference in difference analyses when we're breaking things down by rules of different types. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to make comparisons between communities that do and don't have rules of a given type. And here we're going to use a method called IPTW to control for a couple of different key confounding factors. And I'm not going to go into all the details about how that works, but I would again be happy to chat about that a little bit later. So on this plot here, on the y-axis, we have the difference in perceptions of moderators between communities that do and don't have a rule of a different type. So here, do and don't have a rule, in this case, about peer engagement. And we can see that communities with rules about peer engagement, so that's rules like you should participate in a community, express more positive and fewer negative perceptions of their moderators than communities that don't have rules about peer engagement. And similarly, rules about post format, about tags and flares, user-related rules, and rules about commercialization, so like prohibiting buying and selling stuff, all of those types of rules are associated with more positive and fewer negative perceptions of moderators compared to communities that don't have rules of those types. However, some rules are associated with instead more polarized perceptions of moderators. So communities with rules about illegal content, about post content, and about karma and voting both have more positive as well as more negative perceptions of moderators, and therefore fewer neutral perceptions of moderators, again, compared to communities that don't have rules of those types. And as I mentioned earlier, one choice that many moderators face is if they should phrase their rules prescriptively, like do this, rather than restrictively, like don't do this. And here we find that prescriptive rules are associated with more positive perceptions of moderators than communities without prescriptive rules, while restrictive rules are associated with more negative perceptions of moderators. And rules that mention bans as a consequence, rules about spam, and rules about brigading are all associated with more negative perceptions of moderators. And now clearly, I wouldn't suggest that we should just get rid of rules about spam, but I think these results are an interesting first step to identify rules that we should study more closely. Yeah.
That rule we talked about at the beginning, only nudity on Mondays?
Yeah.
Would that be prescriptive or restrictive in this sense?
That's a great question, and I think you could phrase it both ways. I can't remember how exactly it was phrased in that particular subreddit, but if you said only post nudity on Mondays, that would be prescriptive. Or if you said nudity is banned, Tuesday through Sunday, then that would be restrictive. Great question.
What if the text of the rule said both?
What if the text of the rule said both? Well, then actually we would, because all of those things are categorized independently, we would categorize it as both. And I think I do have a slide at the end and a bonus slide looking at which types of rules are more likely to be phrased both prescriptively or restrictively. We can get to that if we have time. Adam.
Can you talk for just a minute about what you think you're able to factors, like how imagine a lot of these correlate really highly with just the types of subreddits and yeah, just how you're able to.
Totally. So the question for folks on Zoom was, to what extent are we actually able to control for confounding factors here? And I think that's a really insightful question. I think in particular, we're seeing confounding factors at play here with these results about bans, spam, and low quality content, right? I think what the issue here is not that having rules that say you can't have spam and low quality content. I don't think that having those rules are bad, but I think that the types of subreddits that are more likely to have those rules tend to be, both a little bit bigger and also, be different types of subreddits where people are maybe more generally likely to say more negative things about the moderators. And so we try and control for that. I can actually, let me see if this is a terrible idea. I will slip, I have my, no spoilers there. Okay, so right. As I said earlier, it seems that rule additions are relatively rare occurrences, but what we do here is we use inverse probability of treatment weighting to adjust for confounding factors. And in this case, we're adjusting for confounding factors like topic and the size of the community. And the way that we do that is we sort of re-weight the different weights between the communities. So for example, hobby communities are more likely to prohibit buying and selling. So if we look at the distribution of topics across the communities that have a buying and selling prohibited rule, we can see that hobby communities are maybe overrepresented, and then correspondingly they might be underrepresented in communities that permit buying and selling. And so what we do with IPTW is we sort of relatively upweight the underrepresented community, relatively downweight the overrepresented communities, such that the distribution after reweighting is similar between the two different communities. And then we do the same weights for computing those outcomes. So sort of in theory, if you are able to measure all of these sort of differences between types of communities, for example, in theory, if you're able to do that accurately, then in theory, this should work great. Of course, as with every causal inference method, there's like a lot of work being done by the in theory thing. I actually have a whole nother paper on that, which I'm not going to talk about here. But I think the issue in this particular case is, we're categorizing topic, for example, by just sort of arbitrarily labeling communities topics, but there's lots of other more nuanced ways that you could label topics. And of course, with all of this stuff, having even more data would be more helpful. You could use more sophisticated methods. And I think ideally, you could use difference and difference analyses to help control for confounding factors. So there, if you had enough sort of instances of a specific type of community adding a specific type of rule, you could say, well, what changed before versus after, and hold the communities that didn't change that rule to use as your control. Sorry, the causal inference stuff gets confusing really quickly, so I'm happy to follow up on that more. I don't want to just spend too much time on it. Okay, I overshot a little bit. I think that's where we were. Right. So as I said a second ago, future work on this topic could use more sophisticated methods to control for confounding factors, and then collecting more data would also let us do things like difference and difference analyses. So now I just want to briefly summarize sort of the key points of the work that we've talked about. In our community value surveys, we found that communities care about a very broad range of values beyond what's been well studied. And we found that there's no sort of one size fits all set of values. So what's good for one community might not necessarily be good for another. Next, we showed that perceptions of moderators can be measured at scale, and that this is a valuable outcome for assessing current governance practices. And we use this outcome to examine moderator workload, moderator engagement, rules, and their enforcement. And we found that communities perceive their moderators most positively when those moderators aren't overworked, when they're engaged with the community, and when they enforce rules appropriately. And then we identified specific types of rules, that are most associated with positive perceptions of moderators. So in the last part of my talk, I want to deploy good governance in order to have real impact. But first, any quick questions there? Renee?
I guess changes and perceptions of moderators, that seems like something that can move inflation. I guess the community members change their moderators think they're not, or by selection. So like people leave or join who like the moderators more or less. Do you have a hypothesis, or actually do you know like for some of the different differences that you measured, whether that's more persuasion or selection improvement?
That's a fantastic question. So the question for folks on Zoom was sort of for a lot of these things, right? The perceptions of moderators that you're seeing are only seen by the people who are still in the community, and that some people who don't like the community, might just leave or might not say anything. And so there's clearly some sort of confounding effects at play when using this outcome measure. And that's a super insightful comment. I know that also there's a lot of great work, which I'm sure you know about as well, looking specifically at exit as voice as a strategy in online communities. In this particular case, I think I will only now comment on the sort of robustness of the results, and I think you're totally right. This is not a perfect way of measuring community outcomes, and so I think that having the surveys that we did earlier is a valuable way to sort of validate some of this stuff, because we're able to explicitly reach out to people too, and I think that an interesting future way to address that as well would be specifically people who left the community, why they left it. Another concern that you might already be thinking about is, what if moderators just remove the content that people say when people say bad things about the moderators? And that one we did actually look at, and we looked at how much content moderators are removing relative to how much people are talking about the moderators. And we found that, for that to make a meaningful difference in these results, basically moderators would have to be removing, there's a lot more comments that people are making about moderators than the content that moderators are moving. And so moderators would essentially have to be only removing people talking shit about the moderators and not doing any of the other moderator jobs, which based on samples of removed content seems... Joe.
Of moderator workload, how handle moderators that moderate multiple subreddits?
Fantastic question. And so the question on Zoom was, how do we handle moderators who moderated multiple different subreddits? And in this particular work, we just sort of considered subreddits each independently. So, if you moderated subreddit A, we just sort of ignored your participation as a moderator in subreddit B and just focused on what you did in subreddit A. But in the paper, we actually look exactly at moderators who moderate multiple subreddits. And in particular, we look at sort of... That's like our metric of moderator experience. And so we find that basically bigger subreddits are really unlikely to recruit moderators who already moderate other subreddits. So pretty much all of the small subreddits are only moderated by people who moderate just that one subreddit. But in the big subreddits, it's more common. It's actually quite unlikely to only have people who only moderate that one subreddit. Yeah.
There's some talk on Reddit about there being a moderators that are controlling multiple subreddits.
The power cabal.
Is there? Yeah, that's the one. Is there any control that you've made for sort of network effect there?
Great question for folks on Zoom. The question was basically, what about the power cabal of mods? And this gets juicy into some recent events too, because Reddit just announced that they were going to be limiting the number of moderators, a number of subreddits that any one person could mod, which made a lot of people on Reddit really, really angry. The short answer is, in this particular work, no, we didn't look at that. I think that would be a really good thing to look at. I think I will shoot myself in the foot a little bit here and just mention another sort of trickiness that's hard to look at, and that is that it's relatively easy to look at how many moderators the subreddit has. It's quite a bit more difficult to look at how the workload of actually moderating the subreddit is distributed across the subreddit, right? So some subreddits, like I think the science subreddit, has like over 1,000 moderators. But of course, the work that's being done by those moderators isn't distributed uniformly. And that's something that's quite a bit more difficult to measure, because mod logs, like which moderators are actually taking the actions, are private. And this is just my personal speculation here. I think that a lot of the sort of concerns about the power cabal of moderators on Reddit is related to moderators who sort of want the clout, but maybe aren't. They might moderate 15 subreddits or 20 subreddits or an even larger number of subreddits, but they're not actually doing tons of moderation work in all of those subreddits. And there's other factors at play there, like burnout and things like that too. And I would love to look at those in more detail. But my suspicion is that actually in a subreddit with a lot of moderators, actually only a small number of moderators are really doing the work. And similarly, for a given person who moderates, a gajillion subreddits, they're probably not actively doing very much in the vast majority of those subreddits, or even any of them. Thanks for the question. I'm gonna keep on moving on to this last talk just so we can get through it, and then I'm delighted to keep on chatting afterwards. So, deploying governance. As I mentioned earlier, right, I think that our understanding of values and current practices isn't really helpful unless we can actually improve people's experiences in the communities that they're a part of. And so I'm going to talk about sort of 3 parts of my work to deploy good governance. First, disseminating best practices in the Reddit Moderator Council, and then 2 systems that I've built and deployed, critique points and a photo critique coach. So with regards to the Reddit Moderator Council, every time I finish working on a project, I share a summary of results with members of the Mod Council, as well as in other sort of moderator and meta discussion subreddits on Reddit. So here's an example of one of those post for one of the papers that I published earlier. And I can't really share all of the details as the comments on Reddit Mod Council are confidential, but people have really enjoyed these posts. So some lightly paraphrased quotes here. One person said, you know, this was a super informative read, and I'm sharing all of the details of it with my moderator team. Another member of the Mod Council said, you know, this totally aligns with the experience that I've had in my subreddit. And so the results and the best practices from my work have now been shared with moderators of communities with more than 115 million combined members. And then internally, Reddit has also adopted some of my survey methodology and has cited my work in posts that they've shared with other moderators as well. Just flash myself in the face. Who thought taking a sip of water would be risky? So moving on to the photo critique subreddit, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, right? This is a subreddit that I've moderated for almost 10 years now, and it's really grown quite dramatically in the time that I've moderated. And I'm just going to briefly walk you through a little bit more about how this community works. Right? People post a picture, like this nice picture of canyons, and then a comment saying something like, you know, looking for some critique on the shot. I'm not a big landscape guy, you know, how can I improve this picture? And a particularly good comment that someone might write might be something like, wow, you know, that's an amazing place to try and be constructive. I think that the frame feels a little bit unbalanced because all of the visual interest is in the left side of the frame. I think that the river acts as a nice leading line, but, you know, maybe you could try cropping it to make it better. And then the original person who posted this jumps back in and says, wow, you know, thank you so much for the feedback. I'll try another crop. And something that they can do is they can comment with critique points, which is the system that we built. And it activates the critique point bot, which then jumps into the thread and says, you know, confirmed, you're giving a point to this person who gave you some helpful feedback. And so that's just a quick demo of how the critique point system works. This is a system that I built and deployed about 3.5 years ago now. And since then, we've collected 10,000 and counting examples of high quality feedback. In fact, I think our 10,000th critique point was just awarded last week. And then we've used this for an empirical study of what actually makes for good feedback in this specific community, right? I mentioned earlier that it's hard to measure quality of content in a community specific way because it differs from community to community. And this is, I think, one interesting strategy to do that while also sort of incentivizing people to think about and participate in a high quality manner. So what did we find with that empirical study of what makes for good feedback? Well, we found that good feedback is polite, that it's specific, and that it's actionable, and that it answers the questions that was asked by the original person when they said what they wanted feedback on. But it should also actually go beyond what the OP asked for feedback on, right? Maybe I didn't ask for feedback on, you know, on my white balance, but actually if someone chimes in and says, hey, you could change that, maybe that's something that's helpful because I hadn't considered it earlier. And so in the photo critique project, the problem that we're trying to address is that it's really hard for people to learn how to give that good feedback that I was just talking about. And this is especially true for new community members. So we're currently deploying a language model powered system to coach people to give better feedback. And what we're interested in studying with this problem is how teaching someone to do something is different from just sort of doing it for them, right? Recently, we've seen an explosion of lots and lots of these language model powered writing assistants. And, you know, maybe these writing assistants actually sort of cause atrophy of the skills that they are purporting to help automate. But it seems to me that language models are sort of well suited actually to do the opposite as well. Can a language model nudge you to sort of think more deeply about the skill that you're doing and help you practice it. In the education literature, this is called sort of desirable difficulty, that you need to make things a little bit more difficult for someone in order to make them think more about what they're doing and help them practice it. So to study this specifically, we've built two different versions of our coaching system, which we call Assistant and Coach. And both versions are browser extensions that modify the sort of comment interface on the photo critique subreddit by inserting a new little feedback box. And after a user has already written a first draft of their comment, the assistant shows them specific clickable suggestions that they can accept to improve their comment. So in this example here, I wrote that the color balance is maybe warm and the saturation is maybe too high. And the assistant jumps in with a suggestion, keeping what I wrote, but adding a little bit more detail, adding some specific numbers or a specific strategy to do that. And I can reject this suggestion if I don't like it, or I can click accept, in which case it gets inserted into the comment that I'm writing that I can then submit on Reddit. And this entire interface, I blew it up for the slide, but this sort of sits embedded within in the web page. So the coach version, on the other hand, doesn't make any specific suggestions at all. Instead, it uses this sort of chatbot style interface to nudge you to think more deeply about the comment that you're writing and then make those changes yourself. But you can follow up with it, and it knows the text of your draft as you update it when you make changes. So using that same example as earlier, it says, this is a nice start. Be a little bit more specific so your observations feel grounded. And then it also suggests I ask about the intentions of the person who photographed it. So I can follow up with a slightly contrived chat message here, how does this make my comment better? And then it'll give me some more detail, right? It makes makes your feedback more actionable, right? That's one of those principles that we identified of good feedback earlier. And then it also doubles down on asking about the intentions of the photographer. So this is a system that we deployed just a couple weeks ago, earlier this summer. And since then, it's been used to write feedback for pretty close to 200 different images. And one of the things that I did initially was conduct some semi-structured interviews with participants who tried both the assistant and the coach. And I asked them to specifically compare between the different versions. And the responses from a lot of those participants have been really positive. So, for instance, one person said, the assistant is simple and direct, and it helped me explain what I mean. Whereas with regards to the coach, someone said, compared to the assistant, the coach is more tiresome because you have to write things yourself, but I also feel like I learned more from using it. And then someone else said that the coach was really actually very close to getting personal feedback on the comment that I had written, and I was surprised by how human-like it was. So to me, this is just, a couple of participant interviews, but it suggests already that we're starting to see some of the results that we hypothesized about earlier, where people are saying that the assistant, is easier and faster to use. The coach is harder to use because it makes them do the work themselves, but as a result, they're sort of learning more from it. So we're in the middle of conducting a larger scale randomized controlled trial, and we're using critique points to measure the outcome there. So in our setup, participants use the system in like a 10-day long training period, and then we evaluate their likelihood of receiving a critique point during, as well as for a couple of months after they stop using the system to sort of evaluate the retention of the skills that we've taught them. To wrap things up here, in my research, I've demonstrated a scientific approach to improving online community governance at web scale. And there were three critical parts to that. First, we characterized community values in order to understand how communities differ from one another in their needs and their outcomes. Second, we leveraged existing diversity in governance and in outcomes to assess current governance practices and identify those that are most promising. And last, we're continuing to collaborate with the Reddit Moderator Council, as well as individual communities in order to deploy best practices and interventions in order to maximize the impact of this work. So what's next? Of course, this isn't the be-all, end-all of studying governance. And for those of you who were getting worried, maybe even Tim, I'm not leaving CSE, at least not yet. I'm going to be staying in Tim's lab for a little bit as a postdoc. And so I'm just going to briefly touch on two broad visions that I'm excited to keep working on. I have lots of concerns about the degree to which language models and research centered on language models has sort of swallowed up huge chunks of the entire computing field. And I'm sure I know those concerns are shared by at least some people in this room. But I do believe that one task that language models are really good at is providing individualized feedback to people in a scalable way. So beyond our photo critique coaching project, I'm excited about developing new ways to use language models to help train people on difficult skills and improve their participation in the communities that they use. So in this ongoing project, we're developing language model tools to help teach people how to have effective conversations on controversial topics where they disagree with one another. And we're planning on deploying this system with participants in hundreds of different subreddits, running a large-scale randomized controlled trial to define the best strategies to use in order to improve conversational outcomes. Another broad area that I'm excited about is developing more informational tools to empower communities. So since launching that critique point system 3 years ago, I've had a number of moderators actually reach out to me and say, hey, it would be really great if I could put this in my community too. And so I would love to build a better version of the critique point system that makes it easy for moderators who don't have technical skills to use something like that in their community as well. So this would help them incentivize high quality participation and will also be a really useful metric to track community outcomes in a community specific way. And I think that system would be a really great way to not only build more connections with more moderators, but also to serve as a foundation for a sort of dashboard for communities that would let community members track different metrics, including critique points, maybe including some of our automatic perceptions of moderators' work, but also other metrics about how things are going in the community in one centralized place. And I think that this could empower communities to run their own A/B tests on different governance strategies, and then also provide a starting point for community-led discussions about how to make the communities better. So a huge, huge thanks to all of my committee members, my co-authors, my lab mates, and advisors. This work really wouldn't have been possible without a ton of people's help. It's also been so amazing being a part of the incredible CSE community. I'm so lucky to have had so many great experiences with people here. We have the inaugural Egg Drop TGIF, Ski Day, some berry baking projects. I think Amy's on Zoom while Jim's holding the laptop there. My friend Mike in particular, he and I did some great trips together. Another lab hike, a trip to the state fair, and the inaugural meeting of the CSE Telemark Ski Club. And then, of course, a huge thanks also to my friends and family for all of their support as well. So I know we had a lot of great questions already. This slide is boring, so I'm going to leave this one up. But I would be happy to answer any questions that people might have. Thank you so much.
I have a question about last study. Are you more interested in seeing how people give better feedback while they're using your tools or after? What you're also measuring once you remove those helpers, are people getting better?
Totally, yeah. So the question was sort of in the last study, what is the difference between measuring how much we're helping people while they're using the tool versus helping people sort of after we've taken the tool away from them? And that is at the crux of this study for sure. And I think that this is something that sort of start get a little bit philosophical a little bit quickly, right? You know, this is kind of like in middle school, someone saying you have to learn how to do long division because, sorry. You have to learn how to do long division because you're never going to have a calculator on you, right? And now we all have calculators on us, and most people don't seem that upset. I don't think there's anyone from the math department here. Most people don't seem that upset that we, you know, don't necessarily all know how to do long division, right? So the question with language models is the same, right? Like we could conceivably have lots of access to language models for the rest of our lives. Is it still important for us to develop these skills? And I think at least for participation, and this is really just a sort of moral claim that I'm willing to stake out here. I think that for many, not all aspects, but for many aspects of people's participation in online communities, like the point of the participation is human interaction. And even if we could show we could give you a better critique on your photography because we can just do the whole thing with a language model, for me personally, that's not the vision of the future that I'm as excited about. And so I'm much more excited about, if we're going to have these tools, using them to help people build the skills. And that's why I want to take the tool away from people at the end.
sort of a related question. I agree with your assessment of AI being everywhere, not necessarily for good reasons, but I'm sure there must be some pressure to augment or replace human moderators with AI moderators. So my question is, would your rules and lessons learned from your work help to inform how AI moderators might be most beneficial to online communities?
So the great question, Mom. Thank you. The question for folks on Zoom was basically, what about AI moderators? I'm sure there's pressure to add AI moderators, and of course, you're spot on, right? And lots of other platforms that I didn't talk about here, and Reddit too. You know, sort of machine learning systems are doing the vast majority of the sort of at least initial steps of content moderation. But I think one thing that makes online communities like Reddit and like Facebook groups, and these are on Discord servers, on lots of different platforms, different from some other types of online communities, is there is this community sense. And so I think that clearly there's potential for using language models to help out with some of these tasks. You know, I think this would be a really interesting area to explore in my own research, and I know there's other people out here who are doing similar things. I could imagine that like language models to help write explanations for why your content was removed would be a useful thing that could offload a lot of work. But I do think, and again, this is really mostly just a moral claim here, that I think it's important to keep humans in the driver's seat and have these be helpful tools, not replacing the humans, because at the end of the day, the community is about interacting with other people for the most part, not all communities. And similarly, there's this aspect of sort of the moderator is a steward of the community, and the moderator, as we know, has a relationship with the community, right? We saw earlier that communities seem to be happier with their moderators when the moderators are more engaged with the community. And I don't think that language models, just by virtue of being language models, can engage with the community the same way that moderators have. And so I think if you start to automate those things, even if the results suggest that, and this is really just speculation, but even if the results suggest that, you know, the actual intervention might be helpful, you know, person's interaction with the moderators and the relationship with the moderators are going to be changed, you know, if the moderator is a language model, and especially if the person knows that the moderator is a language model. I think where you have moderators, sort of language models imitating moderators or doing moderation actions without disclosing the fact that they're language models, gets a lot more ethically dubious. And I think that has the potential to sort of completely arrest in the system, right? We already see from the proliferation in another context, we already see the proliferation of like false accusations about stuff being AI generated just because it's there. And if that were to sort of generalize to mods too, anytime a mod does something, you just accuse it of being, you know, crappy AI. I think that that would be a big net negative. Mako.
So I have sort of like a high level question. Your key outcome in most of the work that you presented was about perceptions of outcomes. But I noticed that your RCT at the end was actually not focused on actual like sort of like behavior, right? So changes in like some sort of outcome, presumably, right? So political scientists who like study governance obviously care a lot about perceptions of governance, but they also care a lot about like measures of effective governance. Right? Totally. It seemed a little bit like the one in your RCT. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I'm curious why you think that, why you think that perceptions of governance is the right outcome, how you think it relates to the kinds of things that you want to measure in for example, like in the RCT.
Right. So the question for folks on Zoom was sort of how does perceptions of governance relate to sort of the more specific measures that we're using in the RCTs that I talked about at the end. And I think that's a great question. First of all, the cop-out answer is that I think the beauty of an RCT is you can measure, you got to pick one intervention, but you can measure a ton of different outcomes. And I think actually it would be really interesting to measure perceptions of governance as an outcome in addition to these more community-specific ones. But I think at the core of the question that you're getting at is getting down to the thing that you haven't yet called me out on, which is my sort of abuse of falsely saying that moderation is a synonym for governance, right? I said at the beginning, there's lots of aspects to governance, and I'm mostly going to focus on moderation. And so I think when you're looking at stuff that's specifically related to moderation, like the rules that you have, how they're enforced, all the stuff that I talked about earlier, perceptions of governance is a useful metric because it's specifically tied to moderation. But these RCTs, I would still happily, the interventions, I would still happily lump them under governance, construed a little bit more broadly in the sense that they are sort of a system that controls what happens in the community. It's a different type of system compared to a moderator removing content, but I still think it constitutes governance, but it's less directly related to moderation and more directly related to trying to improve the quality of participation in the community. And so even moderators are concerned about improving the quality of participation in a community, but since we're more directly focusing on that with these RCTs, I think it makes sense to have more specific interventions, look more specifically and more closely at the specific thing that we're trying to improve with those RCTs. How do you think we're doing in terms of time, Tim?
I think we're doing well. There's more questions in the audience. Those are great. If not, we would transition to the private. Are there any more audience questions?
So I'm going to try asking the same question that's been asked twice so far. And that is about the use of AI in these communities, but a different answer. The answer previously has been a lot of communities are about this human connection, and so we shouldn't replace all human moderators with LLMs, and that seems exactly right. On the other hand, there are lots of social media motivated. Your talk with point however many billion people on social media, but Reddit was only the number 5 social media site in the United States. That leaves 4 more above it, and they're using largely algorithmic feeds. So I'm wondering, are there lessons from your study of values, et cetera, that should be adopted by those algorithmic feeds?
That's a great question. And the question for folks on Zoom was basically, let me ask you the same question and hope for a different answer about are there differences between what would of my results generalize to communities with algorithmic feeds? And I think this is critical, but I don't want to weasel out of your question. So to me, the question about algorithmic feeds is not necessarily, AI is not necessarily central to that, or at least not AI in terms of language models, AI. But do you want to answer about the role of AI in communities, or do you want to answer about how my results generalize to algorithmically curated communities?
The latter. If I'm running TikTok or something like that, what should I take away from your research to make my service better?
The question is, if I run TikTok, what can I take away to make your service better? Great question, and you're right. Algorithmically curated communities are much more common, and I think that a ton of these results generalize a lot. I think the biggest difference between algorithmic communities and sort of more formalized communities like Reddit, Facebook groups, and Discord, I think, are the biggest ones, and those are big platforms in and of themselves. I think the biggest difference between algorithmic communities is not actually necessarily that there's an algorithm that's ordering your content. I think it's that the moderation is much less visible. And so I think the aspects of my work that are a little bit less relevant to TikTok, for example, are like the moderators being engaged with the community, because like the whole point of TikTok and Twitter is like there aren't really visible moderators. But I think that much of my work does still generalize because online algorithmically curated communities still very much have communities, right? They're not necessarily as explicitly defined as on Reddit, for example, but there's lots of cool network science out there, looking at different clusters of participation on different topics, just like there is on Reddit, right? You've got, I'm not up to date with the TikToks, but there's like book talk and other talks. So like there's clearly still groups within those communities that have different needs, just like on Reddit. And I think all of the work about sort of disparate values for communities with different topics, I think would generalize very much to Reddit and Instagram, et cetera. And then I think a lot of the moderation affordances, even with regards to things like the strictness of rule enforcement, for example, right? We saw earlier that the strictness of rule enforcement, some topics are more amenable to more strict enforcement than others. I think that totally generalizes, even if that rule enforcement isn't as visible or as personified as it is on a platform like Reddit.
Thanks. No question on Zoom. So maybe take this opportunity to thank Galen for his talk. I get to kindly ask everybody to vacate the room unless they're Galen or on the committee, or Sanjay on Zoom. Okay. Thank you for helping with.
Oh, it's gonna be good.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it.